Call the meeting of the Newberry Planning and Zoning Board to order Monday, October 2nd. I will read the agenda. Number one, call to order. We will have approval of the agenda, pledge of the allegiance, new business, which we have listed as none, old business. The first item, letter A, is legislative public hearing, CPA 1703. An application by the City of Newberry to amend the text of the future land use element of the City of Newberry Comprehensive Plan. The proposed changes are related to removing the prohibition on locating concrete and asphalt batch plants within the City of Newberry as specified in policy URI.13.1 and amending the requirements for special use permits as specified in policy URI.1.1. We'll announce the date of the application, which will first be heard by the City Commission. Second item on old business is legislative public hearing, LDR 17-06, an application by the City of Newberry to amend the text of the City of Newberry Land Development Regulations. The proposed changes are relating to removing the prohibition on locating concrete and asphalt batch plants within the City of Newberry as specified in sections 4.17.4 and amending provisions of the special use permit requirements in section 14.7. We'll then announce the date. Application will first be heard by the City Commission. I'd like to add a third item on the old business, a discussion on the definition or redefinition of the chair's responsibilities for administering the planning and zoning meeting. This was a item that was brought up 2 meetings ago, was tabled due to the extensive agenda we had for that evening, so I believe it's probably best that we finish that discussion. Number 4 then would be topics from members for discussion, and the final item would be adjournment. Is there a motion to approve the agenda as amended?
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, motion carries. Next item on the agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, no new business so the next item will be old business, legislative public hearing, CPA 17-03, and I believe Mr. Thomas is leading that discussion. So,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll go through the presentation quickly because it's actually the same as you've seen before. List the audience. Currently, concrete and asphalt batch plants are prohibited in both our comprehensive plan as well as our land development regulations. The A we're listed as a high groundwater aquifer recharge area, which it turns out is most of western Alachua County is high groundwater aquifer recharge area. As
Brian, could you speak up just a little bit until we get the microphone? Maybe we'll pick up.
Usually I'm told I'm being too loud. In our future land use map, you can see core of the city. We have a couple of industrial areas, and then we have a material resource district. The difference between those two types of industrial is that the material resource area doesn't have to be on water and sewer. It's typically a use that, while material intensive and of an industrial nature, doesn't use a lot of water, doesn't require any kind of waste product to go into the sewer system.
Mr. Chair.
Overreach. Oh, for that matter, I can see. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the recommendation basically for concrete and asphalt batch plants is that they either be allowed in our industrial area with regulations, or in the material-oriented industrial also with additional regulation. Likewise, the zoning districts, we have a couple of areas that are zoned industrial only, and so the plants would be allowed in those areas by zoning. If it was an industrial area, you'd have the right, but it'd be under special exception use, special use permit. So the first hearing that we discussed this, there was some additional language that the board asked staff to go back and place in the amended regulations. One of these, this was from another local jurisdiction, basically requires the applicant for special use permit for a batch plant to, actually for any special use permit, because it really is applicable to any kind of special use permit. They basically have to do a report that expresses the expected air emissions, surface and groundwater emissions, if any, noise levels, truck volumes, including the time of day, odor levels, glare impacts, compatibility of emissions, and impacts with other properties surrounding within 2,000 feet. And then it'll also indicate that the impacts will not violate any state, local, or federal laws. And it will also indicate that the best available technology is being used to control the impacts from the industrial use-based use or activity. That way, rather than specifying a certain standard, whatever the current standard is in the industry based on the state regulation, they would have to indicate that they're using the best available technology based on current law. That would be our comprehensive plan has a number of regulations that look like land development regulations that are also built into the comp plan, and so you'll see the same language in both the comp plan amendment as well as the land development regulation amendment. And so the second piece for the CPA, for the comprehensive plan amendment, would then be under specific policy URI 13.1, that this is under prohibited asphalt or concrete batch plants except by special use permit in the materials-oriented industrial land use and industrial land use areas on the future land use plan map as outlined in 14.7 of the City of Newberry Land Development Regulations. So those are the two areas that would need to be amended in the comp plan that would allow for batch plants under a special use permit. And then, so that's actually would be the end of CPA 17-03, and then moving on to the LDR 1706, very similar language. It would change section 4.17.4 under prohibited uses and structures in industrial zoning districts to read that asphalt and concrete batching plants are prohibited except by special use permit as outlined in section 14.7.
And then in 14.7, again, we added the same language for the requirement of the report that it specifies all of the potential impacts, as well as indicating that the best available technology is being used from the industrial base use or activity. And so those are the two areas in the land development regulations that would need to be amended as well. And that basically concludes the presentation. It was brought to my attention we could also, if the board chose, add one final additional piece that would give, it wouldn't require necessarily, but it would give the city the ability to hire an independent third-party, either engineer or environmental engineer, to evaluate the application, because the city of Newberry doesn't have any engineers or environmental specialists on staff. And so if we had a particularly complex or potentially impactive type of application, it would give us the ability to hire a third-party analysis, and then which would be paid for by the applicant as part of the application process. Typically that's going to be probably something at a higher level than necessarily a batch plant, or if it could be the batch plant as well. It would be up to the board to make the recommendation to the commission, and then the commission would decide ultimately. But at least that way, and we really already to some extent have that in our special exception and special use permits. It says that if the city has to hire outside expertise, that it'll be paid for by the applicant. We could firm that up a little bit if the board wanted to add some additional language there.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Yeah, I would like to add that in there in the language of this thing. The city would have the option of hiring an independent third-party consultant at the applicant's expense if we need to, much like we've done with Florida Rock. We have set up an engineering firm to do monitoring and monthly report or quarterly reports on state compliance, and they pay for it. So I think that's a great idea. So would that be written into this ordinance, or is that going to be a planning and zoning recommendation that tags on to the?
I think at this point we could take it as part of the recommendation and then add it to the ordinance that goes before the commission for their approval, rather than bring it back again to the board.
Other comments from the board? Brian, I just had one comment in the discussion about the report. I just want to be clear, that is a report that is included with the application, correct?
Yes, Mr. Chair, that would be the responsibility of the applicant to provide that report and cover all of those issues. A lot of those issues are in the language we already have, but that solidifies that they're going to be in that application report.
Okay. And then do they have to make that same type of report with each renewal? We didn't really anticipate that necessarily in this language. It could be something that's added to each individual special use permit, okay. Or we could just standardize it and say that the report will be updated at each renewal of the special use permit. That's certainly an option. That was more of a question. I'm fine with whatever language will be best, but just okay. I thought I read in there that there is a renewal process for each special exemption. I didn't know if they would have to, if that renewal is the formalities of that renewal and the information that had to be provided. Okay. Any other questions by the board?
Yes, I'd like to ask one. Just to clarify for me, the industrial, we have 3 industrial areas, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. In the future land use plan map, you have 3 industrial areas. 2 of them are straight industrial, and the third is resource-based industrial, which is it's a use that, right now, the only one we have is where Southern Fuelwood's located. But it's typically a use that is not going to be a heavy water or wastewater user. It can be in a remote area. It can be in a more rural setting. So, for instance, typically you probably wouldn't find an asphalt batch plant in a rural area because they have a lot of need for energy, typically gas, and they would have to have some kind of natural gas usually to make it affordable to have it in that location. So those typically, just by default, because of the availability of energy resources, are going to be in a typical industrial area, whereas something like a concrete batch plant might lend itself to the resource-based area just because they have water needs, which can be provided by a well, but they don't have any wastewater needs or any particular energy needs that would require them to be in a more urban setting.
Yes, Mayor.
Just as a point of clarification for the board, if the P&Z recommends to the commission to go forth with this and the commission approves it, that just about sums up the commission's role, because then the state would then be responsible for regulating. These are regulated at the state level. The
Yes, sir.
city would not be responsible for regulating it.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, the state would be regulating the actual operations, the permitting as far as environmental permitting and other factors. So, for instance, the Stormwater Management District would still be in charge of the stormwater runoff basin issue requirements. The DEP would be in charge of any air permits that might be required, or any kind of other permits as far as water runoff, or what's an acceptable level of treatment prior to releasing water back into the environment, that kind of thing. As it is right now, from what I understand, what I've read about the concrete plants, they basically recycle the water over and over again and take out the particulates and reuse them in the process, both to provide cleaner water when it's ready for discharge, but also to save money, because they're catching product that otherwise would have been lost and reinserting it back into the mix.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Mayor.
But I would say that there's a difference between regulation and monitoring. The state writes the regulations that you have to be in compliance with, but it would be on the city, on behalf of our citizens, to monitor it and make sure that the company is in compliance with the state regulations on an ongoing basis. So, much like we do with Florida Rock, we may have to hire somebody to check their levels and make sure they're always in compliance. The state doesn't do that for the individual cities.
Yes, ma'am.
Could you refresh my memory? Last time we talked about this, Attorney Walker went into the history of why it had been specifically left out of our land development regulation. Why was it? Could you refresh
Prohibited?
my memory? Yes.
The history, as I remember him describing it, had seemed to have more to do with, at that time, a competitor joining with some local residents to prevent another concrete and asphalt batch plant to come in, so bankrolling the opposition effort to. But I was not here, but that is what the city attorney had mentioned, was that he thought that there was a competing interest that was behind a lot of that movement to prohibit them. But it was also local residents who joined in and made joined in with a lawsuit to prevent them.
But the lawsuit wasn't what prohibited them in the city. That was part of it, and then the commission came back and
That's true.
made
Thank
these
you.
regulations.
Yeah, absolutely correct. The lawsuit was over an existing application that had already been approved, and then after a new commission was elected, then the new regulations were proposed to prohibit the batch plants after the fact.
And so there, I know it kind of sounds like semantics. They're not left out now. They're just prohibited, and then I always forget the terminology in the high,
A high groundwater
high,
aquifer
yeah,
recharge
just
area.
recharge, area. So they are. Yeah,
Technically,
but
if there was a corner of Newberry that was not in the high groundwater aquifer recharge area, you could have one there, but since essentially all of Newberry is in that area, it's a prohibition throughout the city.
You know,
To Mr. Conrad's statement, if the city of Newberry was to hire or have to hire a monitor, you know, because obviously we don't have the expertise on hand to even evaluate an application, who would pay for the monitoring?
Mr. Chair, typically, not just typically, I mean in all cases that I've witnessed, it's the applicant then pays for the monitoring program. And so I have seen where over time, as the emissions or whatever it is they're monitoring, whether it's groundwater or air emissions or whatever, over the course of 5 or 10 years show that they're well within their allowable limits, that it's been basically waived for the future, or they go maybe from a quarterly report to an annual report or something like that. They cut back on it so that the expense to the business goes down or goes away. For instance, right now the Argos is voluntarily continuing with their monitoring program. They've gone so long now and have been so low in their reported emissions from the third party that the city was willing to let them stop the monitoring, and they voluntarily said no, we're going to continue with it as part of their corporate business model. But there have been a couple of others. I think there was a waiver for the existing Watson batch plant, concrete batch plant, that after a number of years, when they were nowhere near any of their allowable levels, they were allowed to cease the monitoring of what they were doing at that time.
is that dependent on continuity of level of activity?
I think generally it was the levels that were being reported were so low, so well within the limits, that it just didn't appear that it was really serving much of a
Mr. Mayor.
I would say a lot of informal monitoring goes on when it comes to the commission. So the commissioners will get a complaint or a concern from somewhere, and then the commission or the staff would look into it a little bit. And if it needed to be, then you would pass that information on to the state, and the state inspectors would come down and check it out. So there's the formal apparatus that you would initiate at the beginning, but then throughout the life of the business, that sort of informal never stops.
Okay. All right. Any other discussion? All right. Appropriate motion. Mr. Conrad, you want to?
Well, Mr. Chair, also, we would hear from the public on this. We can put our motion in, but then we'll want to have public comment.
Want to do public comment now, or make a motion first? All right. Mr. Conrad, would you like to make a motion to add that?
Yeah, I move that we make a recommendation to the commission for CPA 1703 with the added language that the city has the option of hiring a third-party consultant at the applicant's expense. That's my motion.
Okay. All right. Citizen comments now? Okay.
I second the motion.
All right, it's been moved and seconded. Any public comments about application CPA 1703 and the amendment that's been added? All right. Seeing none, I'll call for the vote. All in favor of CPA 1703 as amended by Mr. Conrad's motion, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, motion carries. All right, the next item is legislative public hearing LDR 1706, an application by the city of Newberry. Mr. Thomas, would
Mr. Chair. What's that? Just for my clarification, I was trying to take notes and listen at the same time. Did that motion cover both the CPA 1307 and? Okay,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, so, okay, thank you.
And I'll make the same motion for LDR 1706. It's essentially the same language in a different document, with the same, additional recommendation to the commission.
Mr. Thomas, did you have any additional discussion regarding LDR 1706?
No, sir.
Okay. All right, we've got a motion for an amendment.
I'll second the motion.
All right, motion's been moved and seconded. Any public comments? All right. Seeing none, we'll call for the vote. To pass legislative, or LDR 1706 as amended, with the, as amended to give the ability of the city to hire a third-party independent engineer. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, motion carries. Thank you.
One last point, Mr. Chair, we need to announce the anticipated date for the upcoming hearing.
Yes, sorry. Do
Be
you
the,
have that date that you know of for?
The second meeting in October, which would be 24th? October 23rd. October 23rd.
That would be for both, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right, so the date application that it will, both CPA 1703 and LDR 1706 will first be heard by the City Commission, will be their regularly scheduled meeting on October 23rd. All right, the next item on the agenda is a discussion and definition or redefinition of the chair responsibilities for the planning and zoning meeting. This is an old business item that was tabled from 2 meetings ago, regarding administration of the planning and zoning board meetings. There's been some discussion about what the best process or mechanics for administering the meeting has been. Mayor Marlowe has administered the last couple meetings, but there's been some suggestion that perhaps the chair should do that. So I wanted to open the floor to the board to see if there's any comments or discussion that the board wanted to bring forward.
I just
Mr. Mayor.
I wanted to apologize for not being clear with my recommendation from the beginning when I joined the board. Obviously, I didn't make what I was conceiving very clear because there was some confusion there. But as I've tried to express to each of you, my intention with reorganization was to model it after the commission. I didn't make that clear, but I have no qualms. I think Matt's done a great job tonight. I think we can continue on just as we have been, and if that's what the board wants to do, then there's been some question about, well, what would my role be here? And I think it would fall into that traditional commissioner liaison type role of where I would listen to y'all's conversations, I would listen to your concerns, and be able to take that back to the commission and be that liaison back. I've talked with Brian. It would be a fairly easy fix if your intention was for the mayor to chair the meetings. We could go back to the ordinance and rework that so that the ordinance makes that clear. The easiest would be to just leave it the way it is, let Matt chair, and we can move on. If Matt doesn't want to chair and he would like not to have that responsibility, I would also just say that it was not my intention. I would like to say publicly, it was not my intention to rework the P&Z to get myself out of doing any work. that wasn't what I was trying to do, but I may have accomplished that goal inadvertently. So that's it. No one up here will hurt my feelings one way or the other with how this goes. It is perfectly fine with me either way. So the board can put that to rest.
Mr. Boyer.
I believe that Matt's done a good job as well tonight. He's proven that he should be able to lead our meetings from this point. But we still like having you there, you know, somebody to fall back on if we ever needed it. But yeah, I fully approve of letting Matt be the chair and running the meeting.
Mr. Conrad?
Yeah, like to publicly say thank you to Jordan for running the last meeting, because that was a very difficult meeting to run, and I think you did a good job, and I thank you for kind of taking the reins on that one. But I think going forward, we have an ordinance that says that the board members will elect a chair, and that chair will preside over the meeting, and the vice chair in his absence. So unless we change the ordinance, that we should comply with it. But you know, no disrespect to the mayor. I think you did a great job as an interim as we transition this organization to mostly new members, and again, I think you did a real good job. That was a tough meeting last time, and I thank you for your service at that time.
Yeah, I would just make a comment that you know, and I guess based on recent history, that last meeting was certainly, I think it facilitated, at least from my standpoint, facilitated my analysis and discussion of the topic without having to coincidentally also having to run the meeting. And so, you know, in that regard, I thought I could do a better job as a planning and zoning board member without having to concern myself with running the meeting. And so that was an advantage in that respect, in terms of not having that responsibility to coordinate the speaker's time and the all the procedure in terms of the meeting. And so so I see an advantage of having the mayor run the meetings. I mean, this tonight is fairly simple, but in situations where it's going to be a little potentially more contentious or more intricate, having that dispassionate non-voting member run the meeting, I think has some advantages to that. So I wouldn't want to shirk my duty in terms of being chair of the P&Z meeting board, but at the same time, I think there's some advantage of having the non-voting member be the administrative person on in terms of handling the meeting, and it allows us then, as the deliberative board, to have more opportunity to focus on what we're doing. So that's where I don't mind being chair, but at the same time, you know, given and the meetings by and large, luckily our city is fairly simple and straightforward, but when they do become contentious, it's nice to be able to say or have that in place, as opposed to if we would have to suspend the rules or start the meeting by turning over the chair responsibilities. I guess that would be the other option.
Mr. Chair, I think you've been on this board for 3 or 4 years. Wanda, you've been on it for forever. I've been on it for 10 years. But the last meeting was not our typical meeting.
It was an
This
exception.
is more of our typical meeting, and I think you can juggle both responsibilities. But I agree with you. If you're running the meeting, your thoughts are, you know, who's going to speak next and how long have they got. And if somebody said, "What was the last discussion?" you go, I haven't really been involved because I've been thinking about how we're going to progress the meetings when it's like it was last week. But that is very untypical for this board. We usually meet in a more relaxed surrounding, and you've had a lot of experience in running this kind of meeting, and you know, I think there's no problem with you doing it.
That meeting was probably about once in every 10, 15 years.
I was just about to say, Mr. Chair, I think we're probably averaging about one of those a year. We had the community Christian school the year before, and
Yes. Yep.
then we
That
had
one
this
also.
one, so. But not often. Not often.
It wasn't as contentious as that one. That was probably the granddaddy of them all.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Chair, I understand that the intent was one thing. I wish we had the ordinance in front of us to reread. Apparently I'm getting choked up over it. I think it's important for us to follow the ordinance, even if it didn't properly convey the intent with which it was meant, because it's important that we follow our ordinances and our charter to the T. And I know discussion, I think it obviously isn't the duty of the planning and zoning board, but it does, there are other sections of some of our board and committee, ordinances that deserve also a look, because we're not following them the way we should be, so.
Just a question for the attorney. In a situation, the once every 10 years meeting, I mean, can we turn the administrative duties over to, say, that the mayor in that case who is prohibited from making a voting opinion, and so thus would be shift a burden of responsibility?
That's absolutely something this board can decide to do.
Okay.
And if that situation ever comes back before us, something as contentious as that, and it's just a simple vote between us to pass that administrative duty to the mayor, correct? Correct. Okay. Sure.
Yes, Mary.
I don't want to be contentious with an attorney, but I think the best thing to do is either go back and reword the ordinance so that I run the meetings, or the chair runs the meetings, no matter what's on the agenda. I think it's I'm not disagreeing with the attorney. I'm sure that it is possible for the board to take a vote, but I think it would be kind of strange to send a signal to the audience that, well, we anticipate this one to be odd, so we're going to shift the chair. I mean, if the ordinance says the chair runs the meeting, then I think you know, because I absolutely agree that we need to follow the ordinance.
Right.
I think that, and I take the responsibility that we didn't get the ordinance written in the way that I thought I was proposing it to the board, but it clearly didn't get written up that way, and there was some confusion in the moment, which was why I was jesting with you guys about my trying not to be absent, because on the commission, you know, you have a pro tem and a vice pro tem for that reason if the mayor's not there. So, you know, it may be a different board when the next one of these comes up. It may be a different mayor when the next one of these comes up. But my recommendation would be that we do one of two things. Either you follow the ordinance that you have now and the chair runs the meeting. If the chair's not here, the vice runs the meeting. Or you go back and you reword the ordinance so that it reads what you want it to read. And I don't have a dog in the fight, but it would seem a little odd to me to kind of change it up on the fly. You know, I'm not disagreeing that you couldn't do it.
Sure.
It would just seem to me like it might be an end for somebody to complain, especially if it was a political issue and if it was a future mayor had gone out, or if I went out and messed up and came down on a side, and then you want to hand it over to me and they say, wait a minute, that person's already taken a public, it would just be, I wouldn't be comfortable with doing it that way. I think it's, you fix the ordinance so the ordinance says what you want it to say, and then you follow the ordinance. So those would be the two options on the table from my perspective.
Mr. Boyer.
I mean, it really seems straightforward, so, if we're allowed to right now, I'd like to make a motion. Make a motion that we adhere to the ordinance as written, and our chair chairs the meetings.
We don't need a
You
motion
don't
to
need a
follow our own
motion.
rules.
You only need a motion if you want to go back and fix the ordinance to the original proposal, but if somebody wants to go back, would you need a motion? Otherwise, you say we're good the way we are now, and this is how we'll proceed, and you can do it with a head nod.
Anybody want to change anything? I guess that's the way we would. All right. All right. Topics from members for discussion. Mr. Conrad.
Brian, I saw the orange signs in our little pocket park up the street, and I was wondering what's going on up there.
That actually, Mr. Board Member, I was almost said Mr. Herrick. It's old habits die hard. Mr. Former Mayor.
Till I die.
Well, actually, I looked it up, but anyway. That actually is for the Kincaid building. It was for the,
So what's going on with the Kincaid?
basically, the reports are such that it's really not viable option to try to salvage it. And so it's going to be ultimately removed. And then probably the property put up as surplus inventoried and sold to someone to then come in and hopefully reestablish, build something else there as a downtown business. It just, after the analysis was done, it was cost prohibitive to try to salvage it. It's so much termite damage and so much other damage. It would cost far more to save it than to bring it back. I think Ms. Kinzer wants to say.
I just wanted to, this would be a good item if you want to discuss it in the next meeting as Historic Architectural Review Board. You could bring that up, and there's probably a couple other things that might be good that you might want to
Yeah, okay.
talk about.
I'll hold off until the HARB, which I guess is next after this, right? Yes, sir.
Mr. Boyer?
Mr. Chair, this is probably more towards a question for the attorney, but I just wanted to verify that each of us voting members are still ruled by the sunshine laws.
Yes, absolutely. You're,
Okay, thank you.
yes, you're welcome.
Ms. Wanda? Jessica?
I have nothing, thank you.
All right. Mr. Mayor? All right. Motion to adjourn the meeting? Nope. All right, with no further discussion, we'll adjourn planning and zoning meeting. All right. Do we need to take a break between meetings?
5 minutes.
We've only been
I
meeting
think we just had
45
the-
minutes.
we just
We've
had the
proven we can
agenda.
do 7 hours without a potty break.
Really?
Yeah. It's up to you. Or do you go to the podium? You can go to the podium. Oh, yeah.
All right.
That's right there.
We'll let Wendy and Brian switch places.
No, we like staying until after midnight. Pretty excited.
All right, well, we'll wait a couple minutes for the attorney to come back onto the dais. It's just maybe mute your mics.
It occurs to me sitting down here that we really need to elevate Judy. This, get the clerk up on this, they work this dial to fix all the wires. It'd be nice to have a little bit more control as well, and teach them, we gotta turn around. I think the actual, the plan is to put a TV screen on the wall, that way facing here, so when there's a presentation, we can keep our, that's all happening.
Without turning our back to the audience.
All right, this is the Historic Architectural Review Board meeting, Monday, October 2nd, 2017. I will call us to order. I will read the agenda, which is call to order, approval of the agenda, old business, which there is none listed, new business, which is an update on scheduling the presentation by the Florida Division of Historical Resources regarding the state's certified local government program, topics from members for discussion, and adjourn. Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. All right. There being no old business, we'll go right into new business. I believe Wendy is leading that discussion.
Oh, sorry. The item is just the rescheduling or descheduling with the Department of Historical Resources, is that what they're calling themselves now? But regarding the certified local government training. And so that item, we just wanted to let you know that we asked the state about scheduling it and seeing if they can come during one of your meetings on the first Monday. And at this point, there's discussion about in January, but that one was the one that's close to the holidays, so it may be pushed back to February. So I will let you know for sure as soon as we get confirmation, and then we'll go from there. But I wanted to make sure you knew that it's still, they hadn't forgotten, and it's still in the works, and on that item. So that'll be about it.
So in January, the first Monday is the 1st of January. Would the board then be deferred to the 8th of January as the first official Monday, or the first working Monday, or just we will not meet that month
item,
because there's the first Monday of the month is a holiday?
We would normally reschedule that for a different date. The second and fourth Mondays are the city commission meetings, so we will be checking. It'll be a different day, and we will be contacting you about a particular date that will work for everyone. So we will do that. So that you'll know that for your next meeting in November, and then you can discuss that at that time.
Okay. I have a conflict on the first Monday of February already. I have a professional meeting
Okay.
in Texas that day.
All right. And the other thing is, would you be willing to meet on a different date if that were what they asked for? And would you like to at least hear about whatever they might, recommend, and see that if you would like to do that, can we send out an email and say, is this kind of meeting date will work for you or not? If you're open to that, we can always do that.
I'm open on,
Okay.
as long as my schedule is open any night
Okay.
of the week.
We'll keep you posted then. We'll try to get it as soon as we can. Maybe you'll be able to do it earlier.
Thank you. All right. If that concludes our new business, topics from members for discussion, I'll start with Mr. Conrad.
Yep, we started talking about the Kincaid building. My question is, would that come before the HARB or would it come before planning?
In the event that they come forward with a new proposal, then it would come before the Historic Architectural Review Board. As you heard, the request for demolition and, recommended that, and then that goes forward, and that issues a certificate of appropriateness saying that that was the best decision for that building, which is what you had already done. And I assume that's what you're talking about, that you are saying if they come in with a new proposal. Yeah, and that would come before you.
The reason I ask that is because the HARB is the end of the road. They're the final authority on that. It doesn't go before the commission. Planning and zoning just makes recommendations for the commission, so that would be a big deal as to, I think the commission expects to see that, but if it went before HARB and we decided either way, that would be the end of the road for that decision.
Well, the Historic Architectural Review Board is looking at it from the aspect of a historic district and what those historic regulations require and what they permit as far as the design and type of use. It still can certainly go before the City Commission as a discussion item, giving guidance. It just depends on what the proposal is. And if they were to ask for rezoning, of course, that would go before the P&Z and then to the City Commission. Just depends on what kind of application comes before us. It's something that, because it's so visible and so important to the community, it will be something that will be discussed with the City Commission and here. But as far as what's under your purview, will be under your purview.
And I think that's important because that's probably the oldest frame building in the city.
Yes.
From what I've read, it was hauled out here from Dudley Farm before the turn of the 20th century, and be kind of sad to see it go. My hope, and I was on the commission when we voted to buy the thing, and my dream was that we would get somebody to restore it. That never happened. It hadn't happened so far, but still hold in the back of my mind thought that maybe somebody will come along and say, hey, I'd like to make a restaurant out of it or something.
Well, it was the city that requested
Right.
made the application for demolition, and that was what was presented and approved. In the event that somebody came along and talked to the commission and said, hey, we've got this great opportunity, we've got a ton of money, and we'd like to do something, I'm sure, that would be discussed. But I don't know, the condition of the building is such that it'd make it very difficult.
Mr. Mayor.
Just to that point, the reports that we got pretty much said there's no amount of money that would fix it, which I always find hard to believe that there's always some amount of money, but that whatever formula they use said there's just, there's no reasonable way to fix a building. We do have two parties that have expressed interest in that site, and both of them had said, have stated that their intention would be to rebuild something that is
Tear it
a
down.
replica, of that. You tear that building down, and we are actually looking at deconstructing, which is a different term than tearing down, because when you deconstruct, you're able to save whatever can be saved. So that wood will be preserved as best we can, and pieces that we can sell to an artist to do something with, we'll do. Pieces that could go back into the construction will be saved somewhere, and if someone purchases the building, I'm sure that will purchase the land. I'm sure that will be worked into the agreement of what you're intending to do there. But both parties that have expressed interest have started off with, we want to build that building back, a replica of it, a nod to the history, that kind of a thing. So we're well away from that conversation at this point. It was simply how much money would it take to do something with. Are we finally, we're going to stop kicking the can down the road and come up with that money and redo it? And then when we got the engineering reports back, it was just kind of a lost cause. It was in the hundreds of thousands, and it still wouldn't be the building it was. It would in essence be a replica, because you'd have to take so much of it out. So
Well, you could maybe keep the facade and build a metal building behind it.
we looked at that as well, and I think the estimate on that was to keep the facade. I can't remember what it was, but it was a big chunk that spiked the cost up again. But we did look at that option as well.
I know when I was on the Main Street board, we hired an engineering firm to come in and look at it, and he said for $150,000 you could make it structurally sound again, and just an open building where someone could come in and redo the interior. But that does seem a little I don't know, with today's hurricane codes and everything, I suspect it would probably be a lot more. But, I just hate to see it go. It's part of the city. Yeah.
Keep forgetting. We have taken a lot of pictures, and there will be more pictures taken to be able to preserve that history. And then that way, whoever does decide that they might want to duplicate that or replicate the building or do any kind of art type of thing, that you will have that information available, and we will be able to have that for that historic aspect. You can keep it in the museum, and there's another historian. There was the lady that came and spoke, and she was quite
a UF's historian.
Yes, and she has quite a bit of information. She's still in contact with us, and so she said to keep her posted on when this was going to happen, since she knew it was inevitable. But she did have a bunch of pictures as well, and she wanted to make sure we had plenty more to document everything.
Okay.
Mr. Boyer. Jessica? Mr. Mayor? Anything else? All right, no further discussion. The Historic Architectural Review Board. Motion to adjourn. All right, motion passes.